Hundreds of flawless perfumed aristocrats lined up tonight, desperate to claim the Western crown. Instead, they watched their terrifying, ice-cold alpha sovereign completely abandon his own mating gala. His sanity didn't snap for a polished noble, but for an intoxicating, deeply hidden scent drifting from the subterranean royal kitchens. Heavy chandeliers of imported crystal cast a blinding, fractured light over the grand atrium. Tonight was the centennial mating gala, a barbaric tradition, dressed up in silk and champagne, hosted by the reigning sovereign of the Western Territories, King Hakeem Crawford. The air in the cavernous room was thick, almost unbreathable, choked with the cloying, engineered scents of 1,000 high-born Omegas. They stood in perfectly organized rows, a sea of desperate nobility, clad in velvet and glittering jewels, all waiting for a single glance from the Alpha King. Hakeem sat upon the raised dais, his posture rigid, his expression carved from absolute ice. He was 32, a decorated military commander before he ascended the throne, and an alpha of terrifying lineage. His wolf, a massive, dormant presence in his psyche, was utterly silent. For 5 years, the Board of Lords, led by his chief advisor, Winston Caldwell, had pressured him to take a mate to produce a legitimate heir and stabilize the volatile political climate. And for 5 years, Hakeem had found nothing but disgust in the sycophantic, power-hungry elite who paraded themselves before him. "Your Majesty," Winston muttered, leaning in closely. The older Beta's voice was a grating whisper beneath the soft swell of the orchestra. "Lord Gregory Harrington is next. His family controls the northern shipping routes. A highly suitable match. Pure bloodline, exceptional temperament." Hakeem's dark eyes locked onto Lord Gregory, a pale, trembling Omega who smelled aggressively of artificial orchids and desperation. Gregory bowed low, exposing the delicate line of his throat in a textbook display of submission. It was rehearsed. It was hollow. "He smells like a greenhouse, doused in formaldehyde." Hakeem replied, his voice a low, lethal rumble that made Winston flinch. "I am not mating with a spreadsheet, Winston. Sir, you have rejected 999 candidates tonight." Winston hissed, panic finally cracking his professional veneer. "The board will not accept another delay. You must choose. The kingdom needs an anchor, and your biology, my biology is my own." Hakeem interrupted, standing up abruptly. The entire hall fell into a deathly silence. The music screeched to a halt. 1,000 hopeful Omegas and their ambitious families held their breath. Hakeem stared down at the sea of expectant faces. He saw greed, ambition, and fear. He did not see a mate. His inner wolf curled up in disdain, rejecting every single scent in the room. He felt nothing but a suffocating claustrophobia. "I have seen all there is to see," Hakeem's voice boomed, echoing off the marble pillars. "And I find the selection severely lacking. The gala is concluded. Leave." Gasps erupted. 1,000 whispered protests filled the air, turning into a dull roar of outrage and humiliation. Winston grabbed the back of the king's chair, his face ashen. "Hakeem, you cannot do this. The political fallout, the Harrington family, the Brightons, the Caldwells, you have insulted the most powerful houses in the territory. Then let them be insulted." Hakeem snarled, his alpha aura suddenly flaring a suffocating wave of dominant pressure that forced half the room to their knees. "I am the king. I will not be bred like a prize stallion for your political convenience." Without another word, Hakeem turned his back on the aristocracy and strode toward the heavy oak doors leading to the private corridors. He needed air. He needed silence. He needed to escape the sickeningly sweet stench of high society. Miles below the glittering chandeliers in the subterranean belly of Crawford Palace, the air was entirely different. Here it smelled of grease, boiling water, and harsh chemical cleaners. The royal kitchens were a chaotic, brutal ecosystem, governed by head chef Montgomery, an alpha who ran his domain like a penal colony. Newton Gallagher, known simply as Newton to the rest of the staff, plunged his blistered hands into a massive iron sink filled with scalding, soapy water. He was a scullery servant, the lowest rung on the palace hierarchy. He wore an oversized stained grey tunic that swallowed his slender frame, his messy brown hair tied back with a piece of frayed string. Newton was 22, entirely alone in the world and hiding a dangerous secret. He was an Omega, in a society where Omegas were either pampered breeding stock for the wealthy or exploited commodities on the black market. An unbonded, unregistered Omega working in the palace kitchens was illegal. Newton survived by consuming cheap black market suppressants he bought from a shady apothecary in the lower city. The pills were toxic, wreaking havoc on his nervous system, but they effectively masked his scent and delayed his heats. Tonight, however, the suppressants were failing. Newton bit his lip hard enough to draw copper across his tongue, suppressing a whimper. A sharp, burning cramp radiated from his lower abdomen, sending a tremor down his legs. He gripped the edge of the iron sink, his knuckles turning white. "Hey, useless!" Montgomery's booming voice cracked like a whip over the din of clattering pots. "The nobility are leaving early. The king threw a fit. We have 1,000 silver platters coming down from the banquet hall. Stop daydreaming and get to the polishing room." "Yes, chef." Newton gasped, his voice tight. He wiped a bead of cold sweat from his forehead with the back of his wet arm. His internal temperature was rising dangerously fast. The exhaustion, the intense heat of the kitchens, and the stress of the massive workload were burning through the chemical suppressants faster than his liver could process them. He needed his pills. They were in his locker, located 3 sub-levels down in the servants' quarters, but a massive cart piled high with discarded silver plates, heavy chalices, and half-eaten delicacies was forcefully shoved into his chest by a passing beta porter. "Polishing room. Now," the porter grunted. Newton leaned his weight against the heavy cart, his vision blurring slightly at the edges. He could feel the artificial barrier inside him cracking. The dormant, primal part of his biology, the Omega he had starved and poisoned for years, was waking up furious and demanding. He pushed the heavy cart out of the noisy kitchen and into the dimly lit, freezing stone corridors of the servant stairwells. Hakim tore at the stiff, gold-embroidered collar of his dress uniform as he descended the spiral stone staircase. He had bypassed the royal elevators, entirely seeking the forgotten drafty passageways used only by the maintenance staff. The raw, damp cold of the stone walls was a balm to his overheated skin. His pulse was racing, a residual effect of using his alpha command to silence the grand atrium. He was angry. He was deeply, profoundly frustrated with his existence. His wolf was restless, pacing back and forth within his mind, agitated by the sheer volume of incompatible scents it had been forced to endure. Hakim reached the 4th sub-level, an intersection of corridors that connected the palace armory to the kitchen storage vaults. The lighting here was sparse, flickering fluorescent tubes casting long, distorted shadows. Then it hit him. Hakim froze mid-step. His boot slammed onto the stone floor, halting his momentum instantly. It was a scent, but it wasn't like anything he had smelled upstairs. It wasn't engineered in a laboratory. It wasn't suffocated by expensive perfumes or layered with aristocratic arrogance. It was raw. It was unadulterated. It was the scent of rain lashing against dark earth, crushed pine needles, and the agonizingly sweet underlying note of spun burnt sugar. Hakim's chest heaved. A violent shudder ripped through his spine. In a fraction of a second, the heavy iron-clad control he had maintained over his biology for 32 years completely shattered. His pupils dilated, swallowing the dark brown of his irises, until his eyes were completely pitch black. His canines painfully elongated, pressing sharply against his bottom lip. "Mate." The word echoed in his skull, not as a thought, but as a biological imperative, a roar that drowned out every rational part of his brain. Alphas did not have heats. They had ruts. But a rut was usually a scheduled, manageable hormonal surge. This was different. This was an instantaneous, feverish reaction to a perfect biological match. The king of the Western Territories was thrown violently into a feral state, his body hijacked by a scent so intoxicating it made his blood feel like molten lead. A low, guttural growl vibrated in Hakim's chest. He turned his head, his enhanced senses, tracking the delicate, sweet aroma down the western corridor. He moved. He wasn't walking. He was stalking his footsteps completely silent, hunting the source of the scent with terrifying speed. Further down the corridor, in the darkened antechamber of the silver polishing room, Newton collapsed. The heavy cart hit the stone wall with a loud crash, spilling silver chalices across the floor. Newton sank to his knees, clutching his stomach. The pain was blinding now. A fever raged through his veins. The final remnants of the black market suppressants evaporated, and his true scent, the scent of a highly fertile, desperate Omega, exploded into the freezing air of the corridor. Newton whimpered, curling his body into a tight ball against the cold stone. He was terrified. If Montgomery found him like this, if any of the guards smelled him, he would be thrown into the palace dungeons, or sold to the highest bidder in the underground markets. He tried to crawl toward the service elevator, desperate to reach his locker. Suddenly, the ambient temperature in the corridor seemed to skyrocket. The air grew impossibly heavy, charged with a suffocating, terrifyingly dominant pressure. Newton froze his breath, catching in his throat. Even through the haze of his impending heat, his Omega instincts recognized the overwhelming predatory aura saturating the space. It smelled like a thunderstorm ozone and dark, bitter espresso. It was the scent of a true, pure-blooded alpha. But it was far more terrifying than that. It was an alpha entirely out of control. Footsteps echoed softly, slow, deliberate. Newton forced his heavy eyes open, peering through the dim, flickering light. A towering figure stood at the end of the corridor. Even in the shadows, Newton recognized the broad shoulders, the tailored cut of the royal dress uniform, and the glint of gold epaulets. It was King Hakim. Newton's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. The king, the man who had famously just rejected the most beautiful and powerful Omegas in the territory, the man who was known for his ruthless pragmatism and disdain for weakness. Hakim stepped slowly into the pale circle of light cast by a single overhead bulb. His face was a mask of primal hunger. His eyes, completely black, were locked onto the small, trembling figure huddled on the stone floor. He was breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling in erratic, jerky movements. Please! Newton choked out, trying to scramble backward, his hands slipping on the scattered silver plates. I'm sorry, Your Majesty. I'll leave. Hakim moved with blinding speed. 1 second he was 10 feet away, and the next he was directly over Newton. Newton screamed, throwing his arms up to protect his face, expecting a blow. He expected the ruthless Alpha King to strike down the illegal Omega, defiling his royal corridors. Instead, a large, calloused hand grabbed Newton's wrists, not with violence, but with a desperate, crushing grip. Hakim dropped heavily to his knees, right in front of the scullery boy. The king of the Western Territories, a man who bowed to absolutely no one, was kneeling on the freezing, damp stone floor of a servant's hallway. Hakim buried his face into the crook of Newton's neck. He inhaled deeply, a ragged, desperate sound that echoed off the walls. The burnt sugar and pine scent flooded the Alpha's senses, driving him closer to the edge of absolute madness. "Mine!" Hakim rasped, the voice completely unrecognizable. It was raw, distorted by the demands of his feral wolf. Newton was paralyzed, his body locked in a war between sheer terror and the overwhelming biological urge to submit to the intoxicating alpha aura surrounding him. The heat radiating from Hakim's body was searing. The king's lips brushed against the incredibly sensitive scent gland hidden beneath Newton's messy collar. Your Majesty, please." Newton whimpered, tears spilling hot down his dirt-streaked cheeks. "You're confused. I'm a servant. I'm nobody." Hakim pulled back slightly, his black eyes blazing with a terrifying intensity. His large hands moved from Newton's wrists to frame the boy's face, his thumbs gently wiping away the tears cutting tracks through the grime on Newton's skin. "You are not nobody," Hakim growled, his voice vibrating deep in his chest. As he stared at the boy's terrified face, his thumb brushed against a heavy, tarnished silver ring hanging from a frayed string around Newton's neck, a ring that had slipped out from beneath the oversized tunic during the struggle. Hakim's eyes darted down to the ring. Even through the fog of his rut, the king recognized the intricate engraving carved into the metal. It was a crest. 2 wolves circling a shattered sword, the crest of the House of Gallagher. The royal family his own father had systematically destroyed and eradicated 20 years ago to seize the throne. The Alpha King stared at the beautiful dirt-covered scullery boy, trembling beneath him, realizing the intoxicating Omega, who had just triggered a life-altering rut, was the missing heir to the throne he currently occupied. Cold realization pierced through the fiery haze of Hakim's rut like a shattered glacier. The heavy silver ring, warm against Newton's flushed collarbone, was an impossible ghost. 20 years ago, the Gallagher dynasty, the rightful rulers of the Western Territories, was supposedly wiped out in a swift, brutal coup funded by the Rockefeller Consortium and executed by Hakim's late father. Yet here was the sole survivor, an Omega in the agonizing throes of a suppressed heat, cowering among discarded soup tureens. "Who gave you this?" Hakim demanded, his voice a gravelly rumble. He fought violently to pull his feral wolf back on its leash, his black eyes fixed on the crest. My mother." Newton gasped, his body arching, as another wave of severe heat-induced cramping hit his abdomen. The sweet, maddening scent of burnt sugar and pine spiked, hitting Hakim with the force of a physical blow. "Please, it's just junk. Don't hurt me." Hakim didn't answer. The political ramifications of this discovery were catastrophic. If the Board of Lords, especially Winston Caldwell, discovered a living Gallagher heir, they would assassinate Newton the boy before morning. But the alpha within Hakim didn't care about politics, consortiums, or crowns. It only cared that its newly discovered mate was in agony, freezing on a stone floor, and terrified. Without warning, Hakim slipped his arms beneath Newton's knees and shoulders, lifting the scullery boy effortlessly against his broad chest. Newton let out a startled yelp, instinctively clutching the lapels of the king's dress uniform. The contrast was stark, the filthy, oversized grey tunic pressed against immaculate gold embroidery and pristine military medals. "Quiet," Hakim ordered, though the command lacked its usual harshness. It was a fiercely protective rumble. "I'm getting you out of here." Hakim bypassed the main elevators, carrying Newton up a hidden spiral staircase reserved exclusively for the sovereign's security detail. The ascent to the royal penthouse took agonizing minutes. With every step, Newton's fever skyrocketed. He pressed his face into the crook of Hakim's neck, helplessly inhaling the alpha's intoxicating scent of ozone and espresso. The friction of his movement sent shock waves of pure need through Hakim's system, threatening to snap the king's iron control. When they finally breached the heavy biometric doors of the royal suite, Hakim kicked them shut, sealing out the palace. The room was massive, diminuted by floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the sprawling capital city, but Hakim ignored the view. He carried Newton straight to the massive silk-sheeted bed and laid him down gently. "I'm burning." Newton sobbed, his hands clutching at the silk sheets. His suppressant-riddled system was completely crashing. Hakim paced the edge of the bed, his breathing ragged. "I know. The black market suppressants you've been taking are toxic. Your body is purging them." He unbuttoned the high, stiff collar of his uniform, exposing his throat as he tried to regulate his own soaring temperature. "I need to call a physician." "No." Newton panicked, trying to sit up, but his limbs were leaden. "No doctors. If they register me, if they scan my DNA—" "I know," Hakim interrupted, softly, stepping closer and placing a large, surprisingly gentle hand on Newton's forehead. "I know who you are, Newton Gallagher, and I swear on my life no one is going to hurt you." Newton's eyes widened, the hazel irises blown wide with shock and the haze of his heat. "You know then why? Why aren't you calling the guards? Your father killed my family." "My father was a paranoid tyrant, manipulated by wealthy cowards." Hakim spat, his jaw clenching. "I was 12 years old when the coup happened. I spent my entire reign trying to fix the rot he left behind." Hakim knelt beside the bed, bringing his face level with Newton's. The raw vulnerability in the Alpha's eyes was startling. "My wolf recognizes you, not as a political rival, as my mate." Newton's breath hitched. The idea was absurd. A scullery maid, a hunted prince, the mate of the ruthless Alpha King. But his own biology was screaming the exact same truth. The agonizing cramps were beginning to shift, morphing into a profound, aching emptiness that only the Alpha before him could fill. Down in the subterranean levels, the atmosphere was vastly different. Winston Caldwell stood over the abandoned silver cart, his perfectly manicured hands trembling with rage. Beside him stood Commander Hayes of the Sinclair security firm, a private, heavily armed militia, loyal to the highest bidder, completely separate from the Royal Guard. Winston held up a crushed, empty blister pack of cheap suppressants he had found near the scattered chalices. He inhaled the lingering scent in the hallway. Even faint, the scent of an Omega heat was unmistakable. "The king abandoned the centennial gala for a servant," Winston sneered, his face twisting in disgust. "He has compromised the crown. The Harrington family is withdrawing their billion-dollar shipping investments as we speak. What are your orders, Minister?" Commander Hayes asked, resting a hand on his tactical holster. Winston's eyes narrowed. He noticed a smudge of blood on the stone floor, right next to a dropped, filthy rag. He recognized the initial embroidered on the corner of the rag N. He had kept tabs on the lowest dregs of the palace for years, ever paranoid that he had missed a loose end 2 decades ago. "It's not just a servant," Winston whispered, the puzzle pieces clicking together with terrifying clarity. "I knew the youngest Gallagher boy's body was never recovered. He's been hiding under our noses." Winston turned to Hayes, his expression turning murderous. "Assemble your men. We are breaching the king's private quarters. If Hakim Crawford is compromised by an illegal Omega, he is unfit to rule. We will eliminate Newton, the boy, and place the king under medical quarantine." Silence blanketed the royal penthouse, broken only by Newton's shallow, ragged breathing. Hakim had stripped off his heavy uniform jacket and was using cool, wet towels to soothe the Omega's burning skin. The intimacy of the act, the sheer care the terrifying Alpha was showing, broke down the last of Newton's defensive walls. "Hakim," Newton whispered, his voice trembling. It was the first time he had used the king's given name. Hakim's hands stalled. He looked down, his completely black eyes locking onto Newton's flushed face. "I'm here. It hurts." Newton confessed his hands, reaching up his fingers, wrapping desperately around Hakim's thick wrists. "Please, I can't. I can't fight it anymore." Hakim let out a shaky breath, his own body violently trembling with the suppressed urge of his rut. "If I touch you, Newton, if I claim you, while you are in this state, I bind you to me permanently. I bind you to this palace, to a world that wants you dead. Are you sure? You're my alpha." Newton breathed out the truth of it, ringing with absolute certainty in his chest. "I'm sure." Hakim leaned down, his lips brushing against the frantic pulse point on Newton's neck. A deep, rumbling purr erupted from his chest, vibrating against Newton's skin, soothing the frayed edges of the Omega's nervous system. But just as Hakim opened his mouth, his canines extending to mark the scent gland and seal their bond, a massive explosion rocked the penthouse doors. The heavy biometric locks shrieked as explosive charges blew them off their hinges. Smoke poured into the opulent suite. Hakim moved with terrifying, blinding speed. He threw himself over Newton, shielding the Omega's body entirely beneath his own massive frame. Through the smoke, Winston Caldwell strode into the room, flanked by 6 heavily armed Sinclair mercenaries, carrying military-grade tranquilizer rifles loaded with alpha-suppressant darts. "How far you have fallen, Hakim," Winston mocked, pulling a silk handkerchief from his pocket to cover his nose against the overwhelming pheromones saturating the room. Driven mad by a rut over a filthy kitchen rat. Hakim stood up slowly. The protective towels fell away. He didn't look like a king in that moment. He looked like a monster. His muscles were corded, his posture hunched, and a low, continuous snarl ripped from his throat that made the reinforced glass windows vibrate. "Get out of my chambers, Caldwell." Hakim warned, his voice an unnatural demonic pitch. "You are unfit to rule," Winston declared, stepping behind his mercenaries. "You harbor the enemy. That boy is a Gallagher. I should have made sure my men slit his throat 20 years ago, along with his mother." Newton gasped from the bed, his heart stopping. It was Winston. Winston had orchestrated the massacre. "You..." Hakim whispered, the realization cementing the deep hatred he had always harbored for his advisor. "You manipulated my father. You destroyed an entire bloodline for power. And I will do it again to preserve the economy of this territory," Winston shouted. "Fire!" The mercenaries raised their rifles, but they severely underestimated the power of an alpha king defending his true mate. Hakim didn't dodge. He unleashed a wave of dominant alpha aura, so concentrated and violent that the air physically cracked. The mercenaries dropped to their knees instantly, their hands flying to their bleeding ears, their equilibrium completely shattered by the biological command. Hakim crossed the room in a blur. He grabbed Winston by the throat, lifting the older beta entirely off the floor. Winston gagged his legs, kicking wildly in the air, his face turning purple. "Guards!" Hakim roared a command that echoed down the hidden stairwells and through the palace comms system. Within seconds, the true Royal Guard men, blindly loyal to the king, not the board, swarmed into the room, weapons drawn. Hakim threw Winston to the floor like discarded trash. "Arrest this traitor," Hakim ordered, his chest heaving. "And his mercenaries, throw them in the black cells. Contact the Attorney General. Winston Caldwell is to be charged with high treason and the unauthorized assassination of the House of Gallagher." As the guards dragged a sputtering, terrified Winston away, Hakim stood amidst the chaos, breathing heavily. He turned back to the bed. Newton was sitting up, clutching the silk sheets to his chest. Despite the fear of the last few minutes, his eyes were locked onto Hakim with absolute awe. The king walked back to the bed, ignoring the smoke and the shattered doors. He knelt once again, gently taking Newton's trembling hands. "It's over," Hakim promised softly, the terrifying monster, vanishing, leaving only the devoted Alpha. No more hiding in the kitchens. No more black market pills. Tomorrow the world will know that the House of Gallagher survives. Newton smiled, a genuine, radiant expression that broke through the grime and the fever. He leaned forward, closing the distance between them. And what else will they know? Hakim closed his eyes, leaning into the touch, as Newton's forehead rested against his. They will know that their king has finally found his equal, his mate. In the quiet aftermath of the chaos surrounded by the ruins of a broken conspiracy, Hakim finally sank his teeth into the delicate skin of Newton's neck. The bond snapped into place, a surge of pure, intoxicating warmth that chased away the cold, dark years of hiding. The Scullery boy was no more. The co-sovereign of the Western Territories had claimed his throne. If you were hooked by this intense saga of hidden royalty, undeniable chemistry, and thrilling revenge, make sure to hit that like button. Share this video with your fellow drama lovers who can't get enough of high-stakes Omegaverse twists. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another heart-pounding story. Drop a comment below, did you see that Winston twist coming?